We are live. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm really glad to have you here in this conversation I'll be having with Emma Seppälä, Ph.D. Emma's a longtime friend, but also just an incredible human being who has dedicated so much of her life and her work to helping us understand our own minds. She's worked a lot with veterans and really how to optimize, right? How to optimize our minds and our well-being. So Emma is a best-selling author, Yale lecturer, international keynote speaker, and she's also a published author. And most recently, her most recent book is called Sovereign. And we'll talk about this a little bit because it's come up on one of my Sky Resilience trainings with veterans. But Emma's really looking at, she's a psychologist and a research scientist by training. And her expertise is in the science of happiness, emotional intelligence, and social connection. So, well, Emma, so glad to have you here. And by the way, Emma's husband's a Marine, so she's she understands the life of a spouse of a Marine. And so glad to have you here, Emma. My first question, it was really interesting. I just finished, and I had shared with you. I just finished teaching a workshop where a retired Navy veteran read your book, Sovereign.
Oh,
And
yeah.
he came to the course and he was so enthralled. I think he said it 3 or 4 times during the course. He's like, this scientist, she does this sky breath every day. Like he was so taken by it. So I wanted to know, how did you come across sky breath? What has it meant for your life and the benefits you've seen?
Yeah, so I was living in New York City during 9/11. And after that day, I seemed to have this sort of really intense anxiety at 8:30 a.m. every morning before leaving my apartment building. And I was trying a lot of things, and nothing seemed to work to help me until I walked into the sky breath meditation class that was being offered by some classmates of mine at Columbia University. And I remember thinking, what is this? Like breathing, really? But then really finding that it worked so well for me. And I was very skeptical. And the instructors, I'm sure that you do this, Leslie, suggest that you practice the technique for 40 days. And I said, yeah, I'm going to do that because I don't believe you. I was a very skeptically minded scientist. And I did it for 40 days and I realized I did not have the anxiety anymore. I was sleeping so well. I was performing really well at work. And it was a time when I was working 3 different jobs and going to grad school. It was really intense, but I seemed to be sailing through things so much better. And I realized then, what a profound impact it was having on my nervous system. That really, I think of it as resilience, stress resilience, because our lives are stressful. My life was stressful, but it's almost as if it creates a buffer. And I think from our research and research by some of our colleagues, when we practice the sky breath meditation, I feel like it's physiologically wiring us to be more in that parasympathetic or calming state rather than the sympathetic, which is, sort of the stress-filled life that we tend to live, with or without trauma. This is kind of our life. And to build stress resilience is what I noticed. And fast forward 10 years later, I was still practicing every day, but I started working with veterans with trauma. And I was looking at some of my colleagues who were doing research with mindfulness, and they were saying the veterans are all dropping out. And I thought, well, yeah, I understand. I think mindfulness is a great practice for people for whom it works. But when you have high anxiety, like I had after 9/11, I would sit there and try and be mindful. And I was just more aware that I was anxious. That's going to work for me.
Right.
And I thought, well, let's try breathing. It worked for me. And I understood, that it makes sense. If you can retrain your physiology to be calmer, it could really potentially help with trauma. And what we found was that after 1 week of doing the program, the veterans in our program, their anxiety normalized. In fact, many of them no longer qualified as having post-traumatic stress compared to the control group. Which was really amazing. And then most recently, we've run another collaborative study with the Palo Alto VA where they included men and women, bigger group, more things they were looking at, and found that it was equivalent to or better than the gold standard therapy for trauma. So I think, especially for people who don't want to go to talk therapy, they want an alternative, but they want to heal. Who doesn't want to heal? This is a great technique.
Amazing, amazing. It's amazing your story ties in from 9/11 that you were there because so many men and women then enlisted
Right.
after that, and then
Including my husband. Yeah.
your husband, and then that
Mhm.
came full circle that your research was on Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, coming back, so
Yeah.
kind of interesting to see that scope of what was happening on everyone's lives getting affected, especially the veterans who signed that blank check to serve.
Mhm.
Um, so many of the studies, can you share a little bit more about what you were
Yeah.
seeing, the veterans who were in your studies? Some like a
Yeah.
We see there's a film called Free the Mind that follows the study, but we don't see the after effects so much. The study ended, or we didn't have the data yet,
Yeah.
for
That's
the
true.
study. What were you seeing with some of the vets? I know you stayed in contact with them. What
Mhm.
seeing is in the longer term space of how they were doing?
Well, so first of all, in terms of like the nitty gritty, when you're running a study and you just ask people, before and after, do you feel better? Maybe they like you. And so they say, yeah, thanks. And you don't know if they're actually saying the truth until you measure their physiology. So we always want to make sure to have a physiological or biological data point to match up with the self-reported answers. And so what we did was we had a modality whereby we would measure the startle response, the veteran startle response,
Mm,
which is very high in anxiety. So think on a day when you're feeling really stressed and someone like says boo, like you jump out of your skin, right? But when you have trauma, post-traumatic stress, and kind of a constant level of anxiety in a way, then you're going to startle more easily than say someone who doesn't.
mm,
And so we wanted to use a paradigm where we could measure that without it being, overly uncomfortable. But what we've found was the most sort of compassionate way to measure startle was to have the participants in this small room where you could close the door and they're enclosed, and then there's the lights were coming on and off at random moments, and there were bursts of white noise through earphones on and off at random moments. Mildly irritating for someone without any anxiety or trauma, but quite startling when anxiety is high, and so we had the participants go through that protocol before and after the study, and both in the control group that didn't receive the sky breath meditation and those who did. And I remember this one veteran. He had been in Fallujah in one of the worst sort of battles in Iraq, and he said this is worse than prisoner of war training. This worse than the Sears
mm.
program that they go through. The first time he did it, and then at the second time he had been through the sky breath meditation, it was no big deal for him at all.
Amazing,
And
amazing.
yeah, it really was amazing. And what we saw, though, looking at the data, is that the more the participants reported having reduced anxiety, the more we saw it at the physiological level. We saw that they startled less. So it wasn't just them telling us; it was their body showing us. And what that happened is that a month later, we collected data again to see, well, if you send people for massage every day for a week, don't feel better. Like, who's to say that this is going to last? And what we found is that a month later, the results were maintained. And what we also found was that a year later, the
Yeah.
results were maintained. That's very unusual, and that is really quite extraordinary, and not something we were expecting necessarily. And what that shows us, and the way that I think about it, is that the sky breath meditation really resets the nervous system back to where it's meant
Mhm.
to be. We are meant to feel the stress response at times in times of danger, but we're not meant to feel it all the time. We're not meant to feel it when we're in a safe place. And this is where the sky breath meditation seems to be so powerful. And then in terms of the latest study with the Palo Alto VA, the study was such that the data was only looking at, is it at least equivalent to the
Mhm,
gold standard therapy,
mhm,
cognitive processing therapy. And what the data found is it was at least equivalent to that. But in another study, the results looked at the level of the brain, what was going on between the two treatments, and the breathing group was the one that actually showed increased emotion regulation at the level of the brain. So there's so much going on here, and it's so interesting because I think most therapeutic interventions, they try to get you to think or see the world differently. Kind of like change your thoughts, change your life kind of thing. And that can work to a certain extent. But in terms of trauma, it's in the body. I remember this one veteran telling me, I'm standing in front of the mall in Madison, Wisconsin. I know there's no danger in the mall, but I have to brace myself for 20 minutes before I can go in.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with his cognition. He knows there's nothing wrong, but his body is still in the past. So
Right.
how do you change that? It's not through more talking. I mean, it could maybe help a little bit, but how is that going to impact the body? Like that book that's been on the best-selling list, New York Times bestseller list for weeks, months and years, I should say, that the body keeps the score. It's true. The body keeps the score. So what do you do about that? And I think that's where the breathing is so powerful, because it really, it resets you, reprograms you back to where your nervous system is supposed to be, which is at ease when you're at ease.
Mm-hmm.
And not when you're not, which actually reminds me of one of the Marines who was in our study. After learning the breathing, he was like, I'm going back in, and I want to, I'm feeling so at ease all the time. He's like, I'm worried I'm going to lose my edge. And I was like, no, don't worry. You're just not going to have an edge when you don't need to have an edge. When you need it, your stress response will kick in. It's just that when you're needing to rest or sleep on the weekends, you can be at ease, which is where you deserve to be.
Right. Amazing. This leads me kind of, Emma, to my next question. It's building on what you're already sharing, but I hear from vets all the time, whether we're talking to them about the workshop or while they're on it, there's initially some skepticism. I breathe already. How is this going to make a difference? This is hippie nonsense. We hear it all the time. Or how is this working? I've been breathing my whole life. Why is this different? How is this affecting my nervous system? Can you talk a little bit about that? And also with sleep. There's such a tremendous impact on sleep as well.
Yes. So, I mean, for the veterans in our study were definitely there for the money. They did not believe this hippy dippy was going to work for them, And I was like, great. Like, I believe in being skeptical because I am myself. And I thought it doesn't end it. But what was amazing is that, I mean, I think veterans in particular have a show me attitude. They're like, yeah, show me. I want to see what's, And the truth is that with the breathing exercises, you get immediate feedback. Just slowing down your exhales is going to slow down your heart rate.
Right.
Doing 5 minutes of slowing down your exhales, making them twice as long as your inhales, is already you're going to see an effect. You're going to see it. And I think that's what's nice about it, because it's not like, hey, do this random thing for so many weeks, and then you're going to see results. Like, okay, and how do you keep the discipline with that kind of thing either? But here, immediately from the first day, I remember some of the veterans being like, okay, like, I get this. Like, I see this. In fact, I remember one of them, the groups that I taught at an inpatient clinic, they've said, oh, this is why we think we smoke. all that deep breathing. But in any case, of course, sky breath meditation is a much more complex, I shouldn't say complex, but much more, it's a complete package, a complete protocol that when practiced together is so powerfully effective from what our data shows for trauma. It's not something to be made light of. It's not a short little exercise. It's really a very powerful program for what we're seeing. And how does it work? I think that we're still trying to figure that out. But one we know is that memory is malleable. So our memory is plastic. It's malleable. And one thing we know is that it can be what we call reconsolidated. So memory reconsolidation, it's something that can shift. And what the veterans often report is, I remember what happened, but it's no longer right in front of my face, right? It's no longer impeding in my present moment. So I think, we can all think of having been in a bad relationship and then being in a new relationship and then having all the fears from the bad relationship in the new relationship interfering with what could be, right? And in a sense, what the veterans, including in the documentary Free the Mind, said was, I remember everything that happened, but I can move on now. And in the case of post-traumatic stress, the past is in front of you, is in your body, is in front of you a lot of the time. And if it's not interfering with your daily life, it may be interfering with your sleep because you have the nightmares that come up or too much anxiety to be able to calm the nervous system down. And so what we believe is happening is that usually when you have a traumatic memory, your whole nervous system responds as if you were still there. when there's trauma, when there's combat trauma or another kind of trauma, thinking about it again can lead to that high, like what we call it, physiological arousal, or the activation of the stress response. And one of the things that may be happening during the sky breath meditation is that the nervous system goes into a really deep place of rest, really deep place of calm. And those memories may come up. They may come up visually. They may come up sensorially. They may smell something, hear something, whatever. It doesn't actually matter. But in some way, it may come up. And as it comes up, your nervous system is actually calm. So what's happening here is there's a decoupling. We call it decoupling. This is weird terms that we use, between the memory and its lodging in your nervous system. And so then it can become like, when you go see a horror movie, you remember it, but hopefully it's not stopping you from going about your day. If it's still there, you remember. So what's happening is that the memory remains like this is a bad thing that happened in the past, but it's no longer interfering because your nervous system no longer responds with that high anxiety, fight or flight trauma. That's one of the things that's happening. I think there are more than one, but it's one of the things we've thought about.
Yeah, amazing. And it's what I get to observe every day in the workshop. And it's so beautiful to hear you describing on the science side for those who like to dive into the research, for the skeptics. And I get to see the more the practical side of the transformation that I see during a workshop in the space of that, a few hours over 5 days. It's incredible. Emma, there's one, I know you've encountered so many veterans in your research, and I know their stories stick to your heart. Is there one story of transformation that just calls to you and that just stays with you?
Yes. In fact, I actually wrote about this person in my new book, Sovereign. I write about her in the first few pages, in fact. Oftentimes, I heard a lot of really, really, really hard stories from veterans in our studies and otherwise. And I think sometimes I've seen that all the stories are horrible and you can't really compare apples, you can't. But oftentimes the women have gone through both combat trauma and trauma at the hands of their own colleagues. And if you can imagine that there's absolutely no safety anywhere. I mean, that is just such a challenge. And I mean, it's unimaginable. And I remember this 24-year-old telling me that she'd had, trigger alert, by the way, for anybody who's watching and wants to, but in any case, she had a baby, and she was sent to Iraq for a year. And during the day she would go on combat missions, and at night she was prostituted at gunpoint by her commander to her own colleagues, making it, of course, seem voluntary on her behalf, but prostituted with the threat, if you say anything, then you're not coming back from your next combat mission, and you won't see your baby again. I mean, I could not believe the story when she was telling me. I could believe it, but I have to say I was crying. I've heard a lot of really intense stories. I was crying just listening to her. And what was amazing about her, and one of the reasons I write about her in my book, is just how sovereign she was. She was very sovereign. She has now become a powerful leader she works for one of the biggest tech companies in America, is a powerful leader, incredible mother. And she was saying her only goal was I just want to be a good mother. I want to be a kind leader. And when she was in she was in one of our studies, and she said to me, if I hadn't learned the sky breath meditation, I would be on the streets alcoholic. And she's now this powerful force for good in the world. And it just goes to show, no matter what you've been through, there is not just hope, but you can still shine, and you can still be the force for positivity, for everything that you want to see in the world, despite all the darkness that you may have been through. And she has, forever stays in my heart, my mind. I've interviewed her for the book, and it also just shows the powerful force of transformation that can happen through this practice. I remember her exactly describing, she's like, I felt like all of this darkness from my past got into this box, went into this box and just like left. I can't remember how she talked about it, but
Right.
the hope is that like our physiology can reprogram, our minds can reprogram, our memories can reprogram. We can get back in alignment with ourselves and with hope, with possibility, with joy, with connection to the life that we want to live, no matter what the past is. And to me, that is one of the greatest things that we can offer people is hope. And that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
That's what you're doing with the tools that are so accessible, because no matter, even if you're a wounded warrior, even if you can hardly do anything, if you're alive, you're breathing.
Right.
So it's accessible to anyone, which I also love.
So beautiful. I always remind vets, it's like, even if you feel like you lost yourself somewhere back there, you're still in there. And that's I
Yes.
liken it to that artichoke kind of peeling back to the heart and rediscovering, reconnecting with ourselves that we, for many reasons, might have put on the shelf somewhere or think is no longer available to us. So, Emma Seppälä, thank you so much for your time. You're incredible. And all the work that you're doing is reaching so many people, and we're so grateful. So thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for what you do, Leslie, for all the veterans out there. I hope more and more people learn about Project Welcome Home Troops. And yeah,
I
it's
hope,
wonderful.
yeah, and follow Emma. She's amazing. Got lots of insights into managing the mind and incredible human being. So grateful to have you with us today. Take care.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.